Recently, you may have seen news about mass and unmarked graves being found at former residential schools. To fully understand the grief surrounding these discoveries, it's important to understand the history of residential schools. I'm Jacqueline Swan with Narcity, Canada. Here's what you need to know. The Canadian government created and funded residential schools alongside the church. These schools started in 1830 and ran until 1996. Starting in 1894, attendance at these schools was required by law. It is believed that around 150,000 children were forced to attend these schools. But what was the purpose of residential schools? In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that these schools amounted to cultural genocide. These places isolated Indigenous children from their families in an attempt to assimilate them into settler society. And these facilities were often located a substantial distance away from Indigenous communities. This made it difficult for families to visit and for children to run away. At these schools, students were deprived of their ancestral language and cultural practices. They were forced to speak English and French, and those who graduated often couldn't fit back into their communities. Students also had their legal identities as Indigenous people forcefully changed. Residential schools were also a breeding ground for disease due to a lack of ventilation and medical screening. Students were malnourished, they were disciplined beyond what would have been accepted at other Canadian schools, and they were sexually and physically abused by the people running these institutions. According to the TRC, these schools caused countless deaths that we'll never know the extent of. Between poor documentation and unmarked graves, we can only estimate that somewhere between 3,000 and 30,000 Indigenous children died at these residential schools. PTSD, substance abuse, and suicide as a result of attending a residential school still affects Indigenous communities across the country to this day.